Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and a witness who was never real, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Testimony That Changed Everything. The scream tore through the manor like a blade through silk. He's dead. Oh God, he's dead. The chandelier above the grand staircase trembled with the shriek's echo, its crystals chiming like distant bells, mourning a passing soul. Lightning illuminated the stained glass windows of Halverton Manor, briefly casting red and violet shadows across the polished oak floors, as if the house itself were bleeding. Hercule Poirot stood silently, fingertips together, as the storm outside raged. Rain wept down the windows in slow, trembling trails. A man lay at the foot of the staircase, neck twisted grotesquely, his face frozen in a silent gasp. Sir Cedric Halverton, billionaire shipping magnate, war hero, philanthropist, was dead. Poirot's gaze did not move immediately to the body. No, it travelled instead to the slightest of things. A cufflink, gold, monogrammed CH lying halfway up the stairs. Odd. Not where it should be. One does not climb stairs with such force that jewelry flings itself loose. Where were you when it happened? Inspector Morley barked at the assembled guests. The room, cast in a trembling half-light, seemed to shrink around the faces of 5 people. Each one paled, each one still dripping from the storm they'd run in from minutes earlier. The clock on the wall ticked, steady as a pulse. Poirot did not yet speak. No, he listened, and he observed. "Miss Halverton," Morley growled, turning to the deceased daughter, "you discovered the body?" Charlotte Halverton, sharp-jawed and sharp-eyed, nodded slowly. "I heard him arguing with someone, loudly, then silence, and the fall." "With whom was he arguing, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently, eyes narrowing a fraction. She blinked. I don't know. The voice, it sounded like James, or maybe Peter. James was the business partner. Peter, the butler. Intriguing. James Langley stepped forward. A suave man, mid-30s, tailored suit, grief artfully held just beneath the surface. "I was in the drawing room with Mrs. Halverton. We were reviewing the South China contract. She'll confirm." Marjorie Halverton, the late Sir Cedric's second wife, 20 years his junior, nodded. "Yes, we were together. I heard nothing." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet Miss Halverton claims she heard an argument. Raised voices. It would take much for her to mistake James for someone else. Their tones, their accents, different. Very different." James stiffened. Marjorie's gaze shifted. Peter the butler stood motionless, eyes on the floor. The lie had already begun. Act 1 had unfolded in death and denial. But as Poirot moved through the manor, his mind was already arranging clues into neat lines and dangerous gaps. The crime, he deduced, was no accident. The angle of the fall, the lack of bruising on the railing, the fact that Sir Cedric's slipper was still clean, no slip on wet floors. And then the cufflink again. It was not loose, it was torn. Poirot turned to Charlotte, who now stood near the fireplace, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You say you heard arguing. What time, precisely?" 7:10. The grandfather clock had just chimed. And yet, Poirot said softly, Sir Cedric was not due to descend until 7:30. He always dined at 8. Peter? The butler nodded. Yes, sir. Routine never changed. Then why? Poirot murmured. Was he already on the stairs? No one answered, but the silence said enough. The storm trapped them all in Halverton Manor for the night. As Poirot examined Sir Cedric's study, he found further oddities. A torn envelope addressed to J.L., half a letter burned in the hearth, only the words blackmail, proof, and witness legible. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A witness. To what? At 11:42 p.m., the police interviewed Peter the butler. I heard voices as well, but not clearly. Sounded strained. Sir Cedric and a woman, perhaps, but I wasn't close enough. A woman, Poirot repeated. And where were you? In the wine cellar, checking the stock. Convenient, the inspector said, scrawling notes. Poirot, however, took a different tone. And did you touch the study earlier this evening? No, sir. And yet the fireplace poker was freshly moved. Warmth in the handle, the scent of perfume clinging to the drapes. Lavender and spice. That is not the scent of Miss Halverton, nor of Mrs. Halverton, non? The butler's throat moved with a swallow. I don't know. Poirot murmured. You are certain. Act 2 began not with a clue, but with a contradiction. A new figure arrived the next morning, Edward Tilling, solicitor to the Halverton estate. He'd received a letter from Sir Cedric just before his death, altering the will, removing his daughter Charlotte from the majority inheritance. The reason? A single line. She lied about the witness. When confronted, Charlotte's face twisted in disbelief. That's absurd. I never lied. The witness was real. She came to me. She said she saw something awful, something that happened between my father and someone at the company. I was trying to protect her. Who is she? Poirot asked. Charlotte's voice trembled. I don't know her name. She vanished the next day. I tried to find her. I couldn't. No one else ever saw her. But she was real. Poirot stared. A witness? Who was never real? Or was she? The red herring came in a confession. James Langley, pressed under questioning, finally broke. I hated him, all right. He was going to dissolve the company, cut me out, ruin my name. Yes, I argued with him that night, but I didn't kill him. Then who did? Morley asked. James hesitated. I saw someone leave the study, a woman. Dark coat, veil, gloved hands. She moved like she didn't want to be seen. A veiled woman. The mysterious witness? No one entered, Peter the butler insisted. No guest was expected. But Poirot's mind was already unspooling. The scent, the veil, the missing coat from the cloakroom, the second pair of wet footprints in the hallway, one large, one small. The storm had hidden many truths, but it had also left trails. Poirot gathered them in the drawing room that evening. The storm had passed. The truth had not. I have seen enough, he began, and the time for secrets is past. Sir Cedric Halverton was murdered, pushed down the stairs, and the murder was not spontaneous, it was planned. He turned to Marjorie Halverton. Madame, you knew of the changes to the will. You were desperate to preserve your lifestyle. And you knew of Charlotte's story, of a witness. Her eyes widened. He told me, yes, but I didn't. You impersonated the witness. You wore the coat, the veil. You made Charlotte believe she had met a stranger. You told her things, true things, because you knew Sir Cedric's sins. Marjorie paled. Why? Charlotte whispered. Because she needed someone else to take the fall, Poirot said. She needed a ghost to blame, so that when Cedric died and Charlotte claimed she knew of a mysterious woman, it would sound mad, a lie, disinherit her, end her claim. Charlotte's voice broke. She used me. Marjorie's lips trembled. He was a tyrant. He was going to leave me nothing. Nothing. Poirot turned slowly. And yet, you were not the one who killed him. The room held its breath. No, Poirot said, eyes now on the quietest figure in the room. It was Peter. The butler looked up, face like carved stone. You protected Miss Halverton your whole life. You raised her. You heard the truth. You found out about the false witness. And when Sir Cedric decided to ruin her, when he decided to write her out of his will, you could not let that happen. Peter said nothing. You waited. You listened to the argument. You saw Marjorie descend, veiled and cloaked. You found Cedric on the stairs, distracted, descending early, perhaps to confront Charlotte. And in that moment, you pushed. Poirot stepped closer. You killed for loyalty, for love. Not romantic, no, but the love of a man who watched a girl grow up in a house full of vipers. Peter's eyes glistened. I did, he said finally. I did. As the constables took him away, Charlotte sobbed in the corner. Poirot stood at the window, hands behind his back, watching the first light of morning touch the manor. Inspector Morley shook his head. And the false witness? Poirot did not turn. She was never real, but she changed everything. He closed his eyes. Ah, but human nature, Hastings. It never changes. In the end, the greatest lies are always the ones told with love. And in the silence that followed, only the clock ticked on. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Fog. The body was already cold when they found it, lying twisted on the edge of the moor, half submerged in the sucking mud of a long-forgotten footpath, a single shoe missing. Eyes wide open, staring at the thick white veil of fog that rolled across the ground like a silent tide. The only sound was the low moan of the wind and the distant clang of a bell from the lighthouse beyond the cliffs. Whoever killed Eleanor Forsyth had done so swiftly, cleanly, without hesitation, and vanished into the mist without a trace. She was running from something, whispered the constable, crouched beside her, or someone. Poirot stood a few steps away, unmoving, his hat tilted slightly against the drizzle. His immaculate overcoat was entirely out of place on the muddy terrain, yet untouched by it. His eyes did not linger on the corpse. Instead, he watched the fog. It was curious, non? So thick one could barely see their own hand, and yet someone had claimed to have seen everything. A voice, anonymous, urgent, had arrived by telephone the night before. I saw it. I saw who did it. Meet me at the old chapel on the hill. Midnight. Come alone. But when Poirot arrived, there had been no witness, only silence. And far below the hill, the body. The fog, it seemed, had more than one secret. Later that morning, Inspector Harrington of the Devonshire Constabulary pulled Poirot aside, a scowl forming beneath his thick moustache. It's madness, Monsieur Poirot. Eleanor Forsyth, head of the Seaforth Gallery, respected, quiet. Who'd want her dead? Poirot adjusted his gloves. That, mon ami, is what we must discover. But already I sense this is not a crime of passion. It is a crime of silence. And silence, in fog, is always louder than it seems. Inside the manor, the Forsyth family estate, there was no warmth, only the brittle kind of civility that forms in houses filled with old money and older grudges. Poirot was greeted not with grief, but with tension. "I heard about Eleanor," said Miles Forsyth, her younger brother, from the foot of the grand staircase. "Terrible business, truly." His voice was too smooth, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. He was an academic, a once brilliant historian who had lost tenure at Oxford after an incident involving falsified records. His return to the family home 6 months prior had raised eyebrows. "Reconnecting," he said. Others whispered it was desperation. "And you were here last night, Monsieur Forsyth?" Poirot inquired. Miles nodded, but too quickly. "Of course, I rarely go out. It's the asthma, you understand." "And did you hear anything? See anything unusual?" "A storm, some banging of shutters, nothing more." Poirot's brow lifted. "Curious. There was no storm, only the fog." Miles faltered. "Well, perhaps it sounded like—" Poirot said nothing more. Next came Lavinia Gray, the gallery's curator and Eleanor's closest confidant. She was delicate, reclusive, with eyes that darted behind round spectacles like a rabbit aware of the fox. Her grief was evident, but rehearsed, as if she were performing the role of mourner she knew the world expected. Eleanor had enemies, she admitted softly, but subtle ones. She had principles. Poirot studied her. "Principles, mademoiselle, are not always universally admired." "What kind of principles, precisely?" "She was planning to expose something. At the gallery. A forgery, perhaps. I don't know the details. But she said it would change everything. She mentioned it just 2 days ago." "A forgery?" Poirot tilted his head. "And who do you suppose would be threatened by such a revelation?" Lavinia hesitated. "You must understand. These circles, they are tightly knit. Sir Hugo Wexley, for example, he had a painting under review. Eleanor believed it was fake, but accusing someone like him, it would have been catastrophic. Sir Hugo Wexley, collector, aristocrat, and, if whispers were to be believed, a man with considerable debts, hidden behind considerable charm. When Poirot met him that afternoon at his coastal estate, he found a man who projected affable indifference. But there was a flicker of something else. Panic, carefully concealed beneath his easy smile. "My dear Eleanor," Sir Hugo said, with a sigh, sipping port as if discussing a cancelled luncheon. "A tragic end to a most singular woman." "And yet you had words recently," Poirot said, "about a painting, an accusation." Sir Hugo set down his glass too softly. "She was mistaken, but persistent, and frankly, tiresome." "Did you threaten her, monsieur?" Wexley scoffed. "I warned her not to embarrass herself." "Sometimes," Poirot murmured, "a warning can be as sharp as a knife." By now, the suspects had formed in Poirot's mind like chess pieces on a board. Miles, the desperate brother. Lavinia, the loyal friend with a tremor of guilt. Sir Hugo, the cornered aristocrat. Each had motive, each had lied. But still, someone claimed to have seen the killer. And yet no one came forward. Poirot turned back to the voice on the phone. The anonymous caller. Who, he asked himself, had something to gain from whispering almost the truth? That night, he returned to the scene of the crime. The fog was back, curling around the rocks like ghostly fingers. And there, beneath the crag of the old Chapel Hill, he found a set of footprints, too small for a man, too fresh to be from yesterday. They led in a circle. He followed them, not to a hiding place, but to a stone bench near the cliff's edge. There, carefully folded, lay a scarf, Lavinia's scarf. The red herring was complete. When confronted, she broke. "I was there," she cried. "I saw someone. I think it was Miles. He was arguing with Eleanor. I got scared. I ran. But I didn't kill her. I swear. Then why, Poirot asked, did you call me and not the police? I thought, if I could convince you, maybe I could control the story. Maybe I could protect him. Protect who? She said nothing. But Poirot already knew. The final act arrived quietly. He called them all together in the drawing room. The fire was low. Rain tapped the windows in uneven rhythm. The atmosphere was heavy, expectant. Eleanor Forsyth, Poirot began, was killed not for what she had done, but for what she was about to do. She had discovered a forgery, a painting sold as an original by Sir Hugo Wexley. But that was only part of it. The forger was not a stranger. It was someone she trusted, someone close. He turned. Forsyth Miles's face froze. That's absurd. No, monsieur. You faked historical documents. You lost your position. And yet here, under the guise of recovery, you had access to the gallery's archive. Eleanor discovered your fraud. Poirot stepped forward. You argued. She threatened to expose you, but you could not risk it. Not again. So you waited. You lured her to the cliffs under the pretense of a final conversation. You did not push her. No. You told her to meet someone who never came. Miles's voice cracked. You can't prove that. But Lavinia can, Poirot said. She saw the meeting. She saw Eleanor waiting. And she saw you leave, alone. Miles shook his head. She's lying. Poirot tilted his head. Then why did she protect you? Why did she call me and not the police? Because she loved you, mon ami. And love, it is both the most noble and the most dangerous of motives. Miles collapsed into the chair behind him, silent. Poirot turned to the fire. She died, waiting for the truth, he said. In fog, in silence. The room was still. Outside, the wind moaned once more through the cliffs. Later, as Poirot stood alone by the chapel, the fog lifting at last, he whispered to no one in particular, Justice is not always a light, Hastings. Sometimes it is the clearing of the mist. And the whispers faded. Chapter 3. The Man with No Past. He died with a smile on his face, his hands still curled around the glass as if mid-toast. The soft glow of the chandelier above flickered in the cut crystal, casting fractured rainbows across the mahogany table. To anyone glancing in, it might have seemed peaceful, almost celebratory. But when the valet entered to retrieve the evening coats, he screamed so loud the echo snapped the silence in two. Poirot stood by the body minutes later, eyes moving slowly across the scene. The man in question, Alistair Wynne, as the name had been given, was dressed in the finest tailored evening wear. His cufflinks were platinum, his shoes Italian. His invitation to Lady Cynthia Hargrave's private charity gala was engraved in thick, embossed paper. His manner, when he had entered that night, had been charming, effortless, disarming. He had spoken of time in Vienna, years in Singapore, a grandfather who served beside Lord Kitchener. Every detail had been seamless. And yet, there is no Alistair Wynne, Poirot said quietly, almost to himself. Inspector Grayson blinked. Beg pardon? Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. I have looked. The name is not listed in any society record. His family lineage does not appear in any registry, military or civil. His passport, perfectly forged. His accent, unplaceable. Even the suit, London cut, yes, but the label removed. This man, mon ami, was an invention, a ghost. Every detail checked out, except he never existed. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Outside, the Thames glistened like black oil beneath the moonlight. Inside the drawing room, whispers stirred like dry leaves. Lady Cynthia stood near the fireplace, face pale but composed. He came recommended, a mutual acquaintance. I never thought. Poirot turned to her. You are quite certain you did not know him? I met him once, briefly, at the Royal Opera. He was captivating, spoke fluent French and Russian. He said he collected antique weaponry. And did he, madam, show you any of these antiques? No, of course not. He spoke in ideas, possibilities. You know the sort. Indeed, Poirot murmured. I know exactly the sort. The room was quickly filling with tension. Guests had been confined to the lower halls. The body had been discreetly covered. The servants, hushed, and yet unease spread like smoke. Poirot turned his gaze to the other guests. Sebastian Hargrave, Lady Cynthia's eldest son, a banker of no small ego, and many whispered scandals, sat stiffly near the corner, swirling a drink he barely touched, his jaw clenched, eyes darting. Amira Lowell, a rising art dealer from Cairo, invited as an honored guest, stood by the window, arms crossed, face unreadable. She had been speaking with the deceased just hours earlier, laughing too loudly, her hand brushing his arm. Now she stared into the fog. And then there was Dr. Lionel Kestrel, a retired surgeon with a calm demeanor and a precise voice, who had taken the pulse when the body was discovered. He had offered no theories, no comfort, only that the man was quite definitely dead. 3 suspects, each with something to hide, each drawn into the mystery of a man who did not exist. The first act, the death itself, had been silent, smooth. No struggle, no blood, just a faint scent of almonds on the glass. Cyanide. Fast, clean, absolute. Poirot studied the glass with a gloved hand. Not clumsy, not random. Someone wanted him silenced, and swiftly. Poison? Grayson asked. Oui, but not self-administered. He had no reason, no fear. He smiled when he drank. No twitch of doubt. So someone slipped it in, or gave it to him as a gift. In the hours that followed, Poirot's interrogation began with elegance and calm precision. He approached Sebastian Hargrave first. You seemed tense this evening, monsieur, Poirot observed. Sebastian smirked. Who wouldn't be, after a man drops dead in your mother's dining room? Did you know Mr. Wynne? Briefly, we shared a table last week at the club. He played baccarat, badly, and drank like a man who'd never tasted real whiskey before. Did he owe you money? Sebastian's eye twitched. Why would you ask that? Because you speak of him as one does a man who cost you something, not merely financially. He was an imposter, Sebastian said coldly. The fact that you're even investigating proves he fooled us all. Poirot smiled politely. Ah, but perhaps he did not fool everyone. Next came Amira Lowell. Her lips were painted the color of rusted rose, her fingers long and nervous. He approached me at the V&A, she admitted. Said he admired my exhibition on stolen antiquities. He claimed to be writing a book on the subject. And was he? Number? At least I never saw notes, but he knew things about private collections, about pieces that had disappeared. Poirot tilted his head. Was he threatening you, mademoiselle? Number just close, too close. And did you fear him? She hesitated. Yes. Poirot left her. With that, Dr. Kestrel was the final conversation. The man was calm, collected, almost cold. I was in the library when it happened, he said. I heard the valet shout. That was all. You examined the body, we? Standard procedure. No pulse. Cyanide, I'd wager. The odor, strong. And how, monsieur, do you suppose he obtained the poison? Kestrel raised an eyebrow. People get their hands on worse, especially someone so elusive. Did you know him? Number, but I know the type. Con men. Sociopaths. I saw them often enough during my tenure. They blend in. Charm. Misdirect. Until someone finds out who they truly are. Poirot's brow lifted. And you believe someone did? Dr. Kestrel met his eyes. Don't you? Poirot walked away slowly. His mind was already painting the mosaic. And it was not a pretty picture. By morning, more information had come. Poirot's contacts had worked through the night. Alistair Wynne had no birth record, no employment history. His bank account, recently, opened with £10,000 in cash. No known address. His only possessions, a single suitcase with tailored clothes, a chessboard missing 2 pieces, and a photograph of a woman burned at the edges. Poirot studied the photo, the outline of a face, a brooch, familiar. He returned to the Hargrave estate, to Lady Cynthia. Madame, he said quietly, your late husband. He served in the war, no? Yes. And he had a sister. Disappeared during the Blitz? Her voice caught. Yes, we never found her. Poirot nodded. This man, this Alistair Wynne, he bore a resemblance. She blinked. That's absurd. But perhaps not. Suppose, madame, he was not trying to deceive you. Perhaps he was trying to warn you. From there, the second act accelerated. A name surfaced. Alexander Whitmore. A thief and wartime smuggler, presumed dead. Wanted for stealing priceless artifacts from bombed museums and reselling them to private collectors abroad. Among those collectors, Sir Reginald Hargrave, Lady Cynthia's husband, a scandal long buried by power and shame. But Alexander had survived, changed his face, changed his name, and now, years later, returned not for revenge, but for justice. He had been investigating, quietly, unraveling the list of names who profited from wartime theft. Amira Lowell, Sebastian Hargrave, Dr. Lionel Kestrel. Each one had ties to the stolen artifacts now resurfacing in black market circles. Each had motive. Each had cause to fear exposure. But only one had access to the glass. Poirot called them together once more, and this time he did not speak gently. Alistair Wynne was not a ghost, he began. He was the last living witness to a crime buried beneath privilege and dust. He sought not riches, but redemption. He turned to Dr. Kestrel. The poison was yours. Kestrel's face hardened. You served in Burma. You saw the horrors. And you brought something back. Artifacts. Illegal. Hidden. You feared he would expose you. So when he turned his back, you slipped the vial into his glass. You knew the dosage. You knew the symptoms. And you knew how to look shocked when he fell. Silence. I could prove none of this, except... Poirot reached into his pocket and pulled a single chess piece. The Black Bishop, found in your bag. Kestrel's expression didn't change. I didn't mean to kill him, just silence him. Poirot's voice was calm. And yet, monsieur, silence often echoes longer than words. Kestrel was taken away, wrists in irons, the rain beginning to fall in sheets beyond the windows. Poirot stood before the now empty chair of Alistair Wynne. A man with no past, he said softly, but perhaps with more honor than any of those with names carved in stone. He turned slowly to the fire. Human nature, Hastings, it hides in shadow. But the truth, it always leaves footprints. And in the ashes of a forged life, the truth finally stood alone. Chapter 4. Poirot's fatal assumption. The scream was not human. It was a jagged, broken sound that tore through the thick stone corridors of Blackbridge Hall like a blade through silk. Poirot turned instantly. A gust of wind slammed the library doors shut behind him, and the single candle left burning flickered in protest. Then, footsteps, running. Then silence. "She's gone," a voice cried from above. "My sister, she's gone." Poirot was already moving. Up the staircase 2 steps at a time, faster than one would expect from a man of such fastidious posture. The night had already begun, with a body. It had no need of a second. The scene was chaos. Ophelia Ravenscroft's bed lay unmade, the sheets torn as if from a struggle, one slipper on the floor, the other near the fireplace. The window was flung wide open, unusual considering the bitter wind that slashed through the countryside like knives. Poirot stepped carefully through the room, eyes narrowing on the details others overlooked. A silver bracelet snapped at the clasp, the faint imprint of mud near the sill. A single feather caught in the corner of the frame, white, soft, delicate. "A dove," Poirot whispered, "or perhaps something made to seem as one." Downstairs, the body of Professor Ellery Stroud still lay where it had fallen, sprawled near the drawing-room hearth, skull fractured, blood soaking into the corner of the Persian rug. A poker, slick with crimson, rested against the leg of the chair. His hand had been clutching a fragment of a page torn from a diary. The ink was smudged, but 3 words remained legible. She lied again. Ah, but which she? Blackbridge Hall had gathered its usual ghosts and secrets that weekend, invited under the premise of a reading of a will, and a private exhibition of Stroud's final manuscript on deception in human behavior. A morbid topic, made worse by the fact that within hours of his presentation, he himself was dead. The guests were well chosen, as they always were, in these affairs. First, Miss Ophelia Ravenscroft, heiress to the Ravenscroft estate, beautiful, melancholic, and ever on the edge of something unspoken. Her brother Ambrose, a sharp-tongued financier with a gambler's twitch behind polished charm. Then Lydia Vale, Stroud's former pupil, turned rival, with a mind nearly as formidable and eyes that miss nothing. Lastly, there was Roland Eastmore, a playwright known for his scandalous dramas and an affinity for inserting himself into other people's tragedies. Poirot had accepted the invitation from Professor Stroud only days earlier, a request cloaked in vague anxiety. "Come to Blackbridge," the letter had read. "I have discovered something dangerous, but I may have made a mistake." Mistake. How curious, Poirot thought now, kneeling beside the cold remains of the scholar's final moment. We all make mistakes, but some can cost a life. In Act 1, the chaos had been presented. Murder, disappearance, and uncertainty. But it was Act 2, Poirot knew, where the shadows begin to rearrange themselves and point their fingers in unexpected directions. Interviews followed. Poirot sat in the great hall, firelight licking the stone walls, the scent of iron and ash still clinging to the air. Ambrose Ravenscroft was first. "I was in the West Wing, writing letters. I heard something, maybe, but the storm was loud." "And your sister?" Poirot asked. Ophelia had been distant lately, nervous. She was fond of Stroud, but lately frightened of him. She said he'd discovered something about one of us. Poirot nodded. "Did you know what he meant?" "No, but I know my sister. She frightens easily, but not without cause." Lydia Vale was more composed. Stroud was brilliant, yes, but he also enjoyed power, especially over young minds. He kept journals on everyone. He told me once that people revealed themselves when they believed they were being watched. He watched all of us, constantly. You suspect he knew a secret? I don't suspect, I know. I read part of the manuscript. The final chapter wasn't about theory. It was about someone in this house. A case study. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And whom did it name? She hesitated. It was torn out before I could finish. Convenient. Lydia's jaw tightened. Believe what you like, but I didn't kill him. And I certainly didn't abduct Ophelia. Assuming, of course, Poirot murmured, that she was taken. Roland Eastmore was the most evasive. People are always playing roles, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps even you. Stroud understood that. He toyed with us, goaded us. I wouldn't be surprised if he staged this entire scene. Except for the fractured skull. Yes, well, he had a flair for drama. Poirot let that sit. He returned to the room. The broken clasp, the feather, the smudged ink. He stared at the page again. She lied again. Again. There had been more than one lie. It was near midnight when Poirot made his first assumption. It was, he would come to regret a fatal one. He believed Ophelia Ravenscroft had been taken. He believed the killer had silenced Stroud to keep a secret. He believed, in essence, that he was dealing with one crime, unfolding from a single motive. He was wrong. Act 3 began, not with a revelation, but with a mistake. Poirot followed the trail he believed was laid before him. The feather, he thought, meant something staged. Costume. Disguise. He found one in the attic, an old masquerade ensemble, complete with a dove. Mask, but it was covered in dust, untouched for years. The bracelet, unique, custom-made, a match to one, worn in a photo he found in Stroud's journal. Only the woman in the photo was not Ophelia. It was Lydia. Poirot confronted her. You lied about the manuscript. You read more than a page. Lydia's composure faltered. No, and the photo. You told me you were never close to Stroud, but you were. Intimately. She looked down. We had a relationship. Years ago. He ended it. Cruelly. But I didn't kill him. Poirot pressed. He wrote something about you, didn't he? Something damning. She nodded slowly. He accused me of plagiarism. Years ago. I thought it was buried, but he told me he would reveal it. He said he wanted to make an example. Poirot stepped back. So you destroyed the chapter, but not the man? I wanted to. God help me. I wanted to, but I didn't. Then, a voice. From the hallway. Weak. Cracked. Poirot. It was Ophelia. She was alive, but barely. She collapsed into his arms, her dress torn, face bruised. He knew, she whispered. He knew about Roland. The final twist struck like thunder. Poirot gathered them one last time. The fire burned lower than before. Rain hammered against the windows. Shadows danced like phantoms on the walls. Professor Stroud, Poirot began, was not murdered because of one secret. He was murdered because he knew too many. He studied us, recorded us, and in his final manuscript, condemned us. He turned to Roland. You wrote about monsters. You understood their psychology. But you are no observer. You are the subject. Roland's eyes narrowed. You have no proof. Poirot held up a small vial. Found in your bag. Cyanide. Same as what was found in Stroud's study. He never died from the blow, you see. That came after. It was staged. The poker was meant to mislead. Poirot moved closer. You seduced Ophelia, used her. When Stroud discovered the truth, that you'd used his niece to manipulate your way into her inheritance, he confronted you. Gasps rippled. Poirot continued. You poisoned him, then faked a struggle, left clues. You wanted us to believe Lydia did it, or Ambrose, or anyone else. Poirot's voice turned hard. But you made one mistake. You assumed I would not see the connection between the feather and your last play, The Dove's Trap, in which the victim, coincidentally, dies the same way. Roland tried to speak. Couldn't. Poirot turned to Ophelia. And you, mademoiselle, you trusted him, believed his love was real. Her eyes filled with tears. I thought he saved me. Poirot lowered his head. Even the greatest minds, mademoiselle, can be deceived. As Roland was taken away, the house seemed to exhale. Poirot stood alone in the drawing room, the fire now only embers. I assumed, he whispered, that this would be like all the others. But I forgot. The human heart, Hastings, it does not play by logic, only longing. He looked at the torn manuscript. Truth is rarely pure, and never simple. And the candle beside him, without warning, went out. Chapter 5. A Voice from the Shadows. It began with a voice, low, breathy, mechanical. The kind of voice that slithered from a receiver like a serpent through smoke. He didn't die by accident, it said. You missed something, Monsieur Poirot. Look at the photograph. Look closer. You will see the truth. Then a click, silence, and nothing but the soft hum of a line gone dead. Poirot stood in the middle of his apartment, on Whitehaven Mansions, the phone still pressed to his ear, motionless. It had been nearly a year since the incident at Caldon Reach. An apparent drowning, ruled accidental by the authorities, reluctantly closed despite Poirot's involvement. And yet the case had lingered in the corners of his mind like the smell of burnt sugar. Now, this voice, this faceless whisper, had pulled it back into the light. Or perhaps not into the light. No, into shadow. He moved with swift precision, opening his filing drawer, retrieving the folder. The photograph the voice had referenced was among the last taken before the death. A garden party, all smiles and champagne flutes, taken just hours before the body of Oliver Tresswell, rising barrister, political darling, was found floating face down in the river below his estate. Poirot had questioned the scene, yes, but the autopsy revealed water in the lungs, no bruising, no signs of struggle. The others had convinced him. Accident, they said. Tragedy, they called it. And he had listened. Ah, he whispered now, holding the photo to the window light. But perhaps even I can be led astray if the illusion is too well crafted. Poirot's finger traced the corners of the image. There, the glass in Oliver's hand, tilted at an odd angle, the condensation blurred. Someone had wiped it. His other hand, not resting naturally on the armrest of the chair, but clenched. Why would one clench their hand in the middle of laughter? The case, it seemed, was not closed. Poirot returned to Caldon Reach that very afternoon. The sun filtered through heavy clouds that rolled low across the sky, like wolves stalking the ground. The Tresswell estate was as imposing as ever, brick and ivy and old secrets. The manor sat high above the river like a throne built on a cliff, surrounded by wild hedges and broken paths. Nature, he thought, reclaims everything, except guilt. Lady Julia Tresswell greeted him at the door with mild surprise and a practiced smile. Monsieur Poirot, she said coolly, I thought you'd left this all behind. I had, he replied, but it appears the past has not left me behind. Lady Julia was the widow, young, elegant, quietly controlled. Her mourning had been the sort that looked more like performance than grief. A stiff jaw, a velvet dress, and not a single misplaced tear. "There's nothing new to uncover," she said as he stepped inside. "It was an accident." "Perhaps," Poirot said gently, "but perhaps not. A voice has emerged from the shadows, madame. One that contradicts everything." She paused, only briefly. "A prank." "I do not believe so," he said, eyeing her reaction. The other members of the house had returned as well, a reunion of convenience, no doubt prompted by legal matters. All were there that evening: Charles Meredith, Oliver's old friend and estate advisor, Evangeline Sharp, the distant cousin and beneficiary, and Dr. Felix Lang, the family physician. 3 people, 3 possible motives, each of them with secrets old and new. Charles was the first Poirot approached. Tall, severe, eyes like smoked glass. "You're chasing shadows," he said, sipping brandy by the fireplace. "Oliver was drunk. He slipped. It's tragic, yes, but hardly mysterious." Poirot tilted his head. "Were you close?" "We were boys together, but time changes things." "Such as?" Charles's lips thinned. "Let us say that Oliver grew ambitious. He had plans, connections in Parliament. He was preparing to sever ties, including mine. A motive for resentment, non? A motive, perhaps, but not for murder." Poirot nodded slowly. "One can resent deeply and still not kill, but one cannot lie without reason." Next came Evangeline Sharp. She was on the surface fragile, porcelain skin, a nervous manner, hands always adjusting something, a sleeve, a hairpin, her gaze. "I never liked Oliver," she said, in a voice just above a whisper. "He was cruel, not in obvious ways, subtle, psychological. He played with people." "You are the second person to speak of his cruelty," Poirot said. "And yet no one spoke it then. Because he made us feel small, weak, alone. You don't speak out against someone like that, not unless you want to be destroyed." "And yet," Poirot said, "he drowned. Alone." She blinked. "You think I think," he said carefully, "that you were in a unique position. The will named you a major heir, did it not?" She looked away. "I never asked for that. But you did not refuse it. Dr. Lang was the last. A cool, clinical man with a face too calm for the profession of death. I signed the death certificate, yes, but only because the evidence was clear. And if the evidence were wrong, then someone manipulated it. But who? And why now?" Poirot stared at the man's shoes, muddy, fresh, despite the clear skies. "You've been to the river." Lang smiled faintly. "Old habits. I revisit scenes. It's how one learns." "Or covers," Poirot said quietly. That night, Poirot did not sleep. He returned to the photograph again, the clenched hand, the smudged glass, a blurred silhouette in the background. Poirot enlarged it. A watch chain, a ring. The details were faint, but not invisible. In the morning, he tested his theory. He requested the remaining glasses from that evening's celebration be brought from storage. Each was unique, etched differently, heirlooms. Oliver's was missing, or rather, it was replaced. Poirot held it under light. The etching had been scrubbed off, poorly. A swap, a concealment. He confronted Lady Julia. "You loved him once," he said, "but he betrayed you, financially and emotionally." She did not deny it. "I found the letter," Poirot said, "tucked behind the drawer of his desk, addressed to a woman in London. coded in affection, and not you. Her silence said more than confession. But then, another call. Anonymous. Again. He suspects the wrong one. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Let him keep chasing ghosts. Poirot's blood ran cold. This voice was different. Younger. Sharper. A red herring. Too perfectly timed. The caller wanted him distracted, which meant the truth was close. Poirot gathered them that evening. The rain was steady, relentless. Thunder rolled over the moors like judgment itself. I was wrong, he began, and that is a difficult thing to admit. I assumed the first call, was sincere. I believed it came from someone who wanted the truth known. But I see now, it was a game, a manipulation. He turned to Charles. You staged it, did you not? Charles flinched. What are you? I traced the call from a public box nearby, paid for in coins from your estate's petty cash. You wanted me back here. You feared that someone else had found what you had hidden. Poirot turned to Evangeline. You found the letter, the affair, the betrayal. You confronted Oliver. He laughed. That was his final mistake. She shook her head. No. Poirot's voice was soft. You poisoned him. Gasps. You laced his drink with a slow-acting sedative, enough to dull him, not kill. You intended only to humiliate him. Let him fall, let him suffer. But the dosage was wrong. The drink mixed poorly with his medication. And he died. She began to cry. I didn't mean... And then, Poirot said, eyes narrowing, Charles discovered the letter, the glass, and knew the truth. But he protected you, because he loves you. Silence. Poirot stepped back. The anonymous tip was from Charles, not to expose the killer, but to redirect the guilt, to hide the truth in shadows. Evangeline sobbed. Charles looked away. Lady Julia sat, unmoving. The weight of it all settled like dust. Poirot turned to the window. Rain streaked down the glass like tears. We are drawn to shadows, he said, because they offer us comfort, but it is only in light that the truth survives. As he left the manor, the wind howled behind him, and the river below whispered its secrets to the stones. Chapter 6. Motive without a murder. The scream echoed through the chapel ruins, shrill and sudden, as if it had torn its way up from the very bones of the earth. Poirot did not run. He walked steady, deliberate, his footsteps crunching over broken stone and damp moss. The air was thick with mist, and through it, the spire of the crumbling abbey loomed like a corpse's hand reaching for the sky. A candle burned inside, flickering wildly, and beside it, on the altar, cracked by time and storms, a single phrase was scratched into the wood. Je suis témoin. I am the witness. Yet there was no body, no blood, no victim. Only the panic in the eyes of Miss Eloise Denham, standing with shaking hands beside the altar, her face lit ghost-like by the candle's flame. She was here, she whispered, voice fractured. She was right there. She told me she saw it. She knew who did it. And now she's gone. Poirot raised a brow. And who, mademoiselle, is she? I don't know, Eloise breathed. I never got her name. He stepped forward slowly, eyes scanning the ground. No footprints, not in the soft moss that should have remembered every step. No dropped scarf, no scent of perfume in the air. Nothing but candle wax and panic. This, Poirot thought, was not how murder mysteries usually begin. But perhaps this was not a murder mystery at all. Not yet. The case had not come to him through telegram or inspector. It had come in the form of a letter, handwritten, without return address, on parchment so old the ink had bled. Come to St. Eustace's Hollow. A crime has been committed, but no one is dead. Yet. That was all. No signature, no sender. And now, this woman, speaking of a witness that no one had seen but her. There is something most dangerous, he thought, about a witness who cannot be questioned. The truth cannot stand when it wears a phantom's cloak. The estate adjacent to the ruins was called Hallowmere House. Grey stone, iron gates, curtains drawn like eyelids closed in a permanent dream. The caretaker, a man named Bramley, had not expected guests, but did not seem surprised. "You've come for the girl, haven't you?" he muttered, voice gravel thick. Poirot inclined his head. "Which girl, monsieur?" "The one who disappeared. They never found her." Poirot paused. "When was this?" "6 years ago," Bramley said, leaning on his cane, "before the new owner took over. She vanished in that very chapel. Same place the lady says she saw the ghost." "Ah," Poirot said, "then perhaps we are looking not at one mystery, but two." Eloise Denham had come to Hallowmere for solitude. She was a pianist, well regarded in London, recently vanished from society papers after a cancelled tour and a rumoured scandal involving a wealthy patron. She claimed the chapel was where she practiced now, each evening, for peace. "And you say the woman, this witness, appeared during your practice?" "Yes. She stepped out from the back. I thought I imagined her at first. She said she'd seen a crime. Recent. She told me a man in this house had blood on his hands. Then she walked into the dark." Poirot was silent for a long time. "You are certain she said recent?" "She said days ago. And that, mon Dieu, changed everything. If there had been a crime, and no murder, then something else had occurred. Something just as sinister." He interviewed the other residents of the house. Edgar Woolcombe, owner of the estate, was a reclusive novelist whose fame had withered into obscurity. His last book, In the Hall of the Silent Ones, had been accused of plagiarism and pulled from shelves. Since then, he lived in near-complete isolation. Sharp mind, cold eyes. "I don't concern myself with village gossip," he said flatly, "and I certainly don't believe in ghosts." "Do you believe in crime, monsieur?" Poirot asked. "I believe in human nature. Which is worse?" His wife, Delilah Woolcombe, was striking, tall, with eyes like a storm held in glass. Younger than her husband by 2 decades, she had once been a theatre actress, praised for roles of cunning and betrayal. Now she claimed to have left that world behind. "The stage is never far," Poirot noted aloud. Delilah tilted her head. "You think I'm performing?" "No," Poirot replied. "I think perhaps you are tired of pretending." The final guest was Dr. Silas Rowe, a psychologist residing at the estate for observation purposes, as he put it. "Mr. Woolcombe has episodes," he said confidentially. "He's asked me to monitor him." "Episodes of what? Nature? Paranoia? Isolation-induced delusions? He believes the estate is cursed, that someone watches him." Poirot found this most curious, for it matched, uncomfortably, the description given by Eloise. A man with blood on his hands, watched, haunted, but still. No body, no murder. And yet Poirot could feel it. The weight of guilt in the halls, the way the eyes of the household followed him, but never met his gaze. The piano in the chapel playing a note too flat, too sharp, too off. A household where every truth was wrapped in silk and silence. He returned to the chapel that evening. This time, the candle was already lit. On the altar now was a small scrap of fabric. Torn. Silk. Burgundy. He brought it to Eloise. "Is this yours?" She gasped. That's the scarf I lost 2 days ago. I thought I'd left it by the river. How did it come to be where the witness stood? I don't know. Are you certain, mademoiselle? Her eyes welled with confusion. Are you saying I planted it? That I lied? Poirot said nothing, because for the first time, he wasn't sure. Act 2 revealed the first cracks in reality. Delilah had been seen leaving the house late at night. Bramley claimed she often wandered the chapel ruins. Dr. Rowe claimed she suffered from somnambulism. She walks in her sleep, he said. That's all. There's no conspiracy here. But Poirot's instincts prickled. She walks to the same place, always. Why? Then there was Edgar's manuscript, hidden in a locked drawer. Poirot found the key beneath the floorboard, in the study. The manuscript was incomplete, but its plot unnerving. A man kills a woman by accident, buries her beneath an altar, then hallucinates her ghost, who accuses him nightly until he goes mad. Fiction or confession? He confronted Edgar. Tell me, monsieur, was it an invention or a memory? Edgar stared at the manuscript. I wrote it in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Sometimes I can't tell. A convenient answer. A truthful one. Poirot studied the handwriting. It matched a letter found in the pocket of the scarf, a letter addressed to Delilah. I know what you did, it read, but I love you still. Poirot now saw it clearly. There was no murder, because the murder had already happened, years ago, covered, buried, hidden, but the crime was fresh. Someone had exhumed the secret. Delilah, confronted with the letter, finally spoke. 6 years ago, she whispered, I was not his wife. I was his mistress. The girl who vanished, Caroline, she discovered us. She threatened to expose Edgar. I followed her. I begged her. She slapped me. I pushed. She struck her head, Poirot said softly. Delilah nodded. I buried her there, beneath the chapel. Poirot closed his eyes. And the witness? There is no witness, at least not one of flesh. But someone found out. Someone is trying to punish me. That someone was Eloise. She had lied. Not maliciously, perhaps, but poetically. She had read Edgar's manuscript, found the scarf, discovered the truth, and became the ghost. I thought if she confessed, Eloise whispered, if she admitted it, I could finally sleep. I hear her screams, not Delilah's, Caroline's. Poirot stepped back. There was no recent crime, he said aloud. Only the illusion of one. A motive, yes. A killer, yes. But the murder is in the past, and the witness was never truly there. The police would not arrest Delilah. The statute of limitation, the lack of forensic remains. But her life, Poirot knew, would never return. As he left the estate, mist curling at his feet like regret, he paused and looked back at the ruins. To kill is not only to end a life, he murmured. It is to bury the truth. But truth, Hastings, she does not stay buried. She has roots. And in the chapel behind him, the candle extinguished itself. Chapter 7. The photograph that shouldn't exist. The photograph arrived in an unmarked envelope, slid beneath Poirot's door as the rain drummed softly on the windows of Whitehaven mansions. No letter accompanied it, no message, only a single, square image, slightly warped with age, its edges curled, and the paper faintly yellowed, as though it had been hidden for years. But it was not the physical decay of the photograph that caught Poirot's eye. It was what it contained, a moment frozen in time. Grainy, but unmistakable. A face, a name, a man long presumed dead. Poirot turned the photograph in the light. A party scene, outside, a summer garden, trees, lanterns, laughter. And in the foreground, smiling as though nothing in the world could touch him, was Julian Armitage, beloved philanthropist, celebrated author, and by all official accounts, murdered in his study 12 years ago. Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Ah," he whispered to himself, "but the camera, mon ami, it captures what the eye forgets, and sometimes what the world should not see again." He had been present at Julian Armitage's funeral. Closed casket, blunt force trauma to the head. The case had seemed simple enough at the time. A break-in, a thief surprised, a struggle. Armitage dead, case closed. And yet, here he was, or so it seemed, perfectly alive in a photograph taken 6 months ago. Poirot dressed immediately. There was no hesitation. For a man who does not exist to appear again, there must either be a mistake or a lie so perfect it had endured a decade. His journey led him back to Ravenscombe, the seaside town where the Armitage estate still sat like a wounded relic from another century. It was all as Poirot remembered it. Stone turrets wrapped in ivy, windows shuttered despite the season, and a sense of stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. It was a house full of survivors, and in Poirot's experience, survivors often survived for a reason. Lady Helena Armitage received him with tightly veiled surprise. She was older now, of course, but time had not stolen her presence, only sharpened it. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice carefully polite, "you come on strange business." "Stranger than you might think," Poirot replied, producing the photograph. Her hands trembled as she took it. "My God," she breathed. "You recognize it?" "Yes, and no. It appears to be Julian. But no, it cannot be." "But it is," Poirot said calmly. "The location?" Helena hesitated. "That looks like Branthorpe House. We attended a summer gala there just before Julian died. But this cannot be from then. The decor, the garden, these lanterns, they are new. I saw them first at last year's solstice ball." "Then the photograph," Poirot said softly, "is recent." Helena looked away. "That's impossible." Poirot said nothing. Instead, he began his work. In Act 1, there is always the shock, the disruption of what has been buried. The Armitage murder had been a neat tragedy. A thief caught in the act. A servant confessed under pressure. Harold Green, a young man with no family, already suspected of petty crimes. He vanished from prison 6 years into his sentence, presumed drowned in the marsh. The case was forgotten. But now, the ghost returned. Poirot spoke first with 3 remaining residents of Ravenscombe who had known Julian closely. First was Dr. Evelyn Marsh, the family physician and a friend of Julian's from university. Tall, silver-haired, and always composed, she greeted Poirot with practiced warmth. "A photograph? Surely a trick? A manipulation? Julian is gone, Monsieur Poirot." "And yet," Poirot said, "if he is not, the implication is enormous." Evelyn smiled tightly. "Then let us hope it is merely an illusion." Then came Anthony Cresswell, Julian's former literary agent, who had since retired to the countryside under a cloud of quiet scandal. Julian was about to publish a manuscript, he told Poirot, a controversial one. Names, accusations. He claimed he had evidence of a conspiracy involving several public figures. I warned him, but he insisted, said it would change everything. "Did you read it?" "Number it vanished after his death." "And the only copy?" Anthony hesitated. "He kept it in the study safe." Poirot nodded. "The same study where he was murdered." The third was Isabelle Doran, Julian's niece. She had lived in the house since she was a girl, orphaned at 10, raised by her uncle and Lady Helena. She was in her late 20s, now bright-eyed, quick to smile, and just slightly too rehearsed in her grief. Uncle Julian was a brilliant man, she said softly. But brilliant people, they often make enemies. And did he? Poirot asked. Oh yes, Isabel said. But some enemies, Monsieur Poirot, are closer than we think. The photograph was real. Poirot confirmed that through the ink, the film type, the faint markings on the back, a date, partially faded, 6 months prior. The location was Branthorpe House, as Helena had claimed. The photographer, anonymous, the sender, unknown, and yet, Poirot began to see the gaps, the inconsistencies. The photograph proved something, but not what it seemed to prove. In Act 2, the clues multiplied. Poirot visited Branthorpe, spoke with the staff. No one remembered Julian Armitage. No one admitted to seeing him. But one servant mentioned something curious, that an uninvited guest had slipped into the gala wearing a vintage mask, posed for a few photographs, then disappeared. His name never recorded. A mask, a shadow. Poirot returned to Ravenscombe. And that is when he found the second photograph, tucked into the pages of a book in the old study, Julian's copy of the Count of Monte Cristo. Another image, the same party, different angle. This time, the man's face was not fully visible, just a sliver of jawline, a watch chain, and a scar. A scar. Harold Green had a scar, a detail Poirot remembered from the trial transcript. Across the neck, faint but visible, and just like that, the red herring snapped into focus. The man in the photograph was not Julian Armitage, it was Harold Green, disguised, carefully, precisely. But why? Poirot called a meeting at the estate. Someone wanted me to believe Julian Armitage lives, he began. But the truth is more elegant and more cruel. It was Green, alive, disguised as the man he was accused of killing. Why? The room was silent. Poirot turned to Anthony Cresswell. You knew the manuscript was stolen. You suspected Julian had hidden it, but you never found it. You thought if Green was still alive, he might lead you to it. Anthony's eyes widened. That's absurd. Is it? You sent the photograph, hoping I would come, stir the pot, perhaps bring Green out of hiding. Anthony faltered. Yes, but I didn't kill Julian. I swear it. Poirot then turned to Evelyn Marsh. You claimed Julian died of blunt force trauma, but you never opened the body. No autopsy was performed. You declared the death without question. Evelyn stiffened. The evidence was clear. No, Poirot said. It was staged. Green was framed. The real killer was Julian. Gasps. Poirot raised his hand. Julian Armitage faked his death. He knew his manuscript would destroy powerful people and that it would cost him his life. So, he vanished. Framed Green. Burned the safe. Hid the truth. But Green survived. And came back. Not for revenge. For justice. Poirot walked to the desk, opened the hidden compartment, pulled out the manuscript. The book, he said, that was supposed to change everything. Helena's face broke. I helped him, she whispered. He begged me, said it was the only way, but he never returned. He left me here to live the lie alone. Poirot's voice softened, and in doing so, madame, he became the very thing he feared. In the end, the photograph proved everything, and nothing at all, just a moment, a mask, a lie in a frame. Poirot sat alone that night in the study, rain whispering against the glass. He stared at the photo once more. Ah, but the camera, he murmured. It sees everything, yes, but it understands nothing. And he tucked the photograph away, where even the truth could no longer reach it. Chapter 8. The Alibi Puzzle. The grandfather clock struck midnight, and with it came the sound of glass shattering across the marble floor of Greystone Manor. Seconds later, a scream followed. Short, breathless, the kind that doesn't linger because the throat from which it came no longer can. Poirot was already out of his chair in the drawing room before the last echo faded. He moved not with panic, but with purpose, his hand closing softly around the silver handle of his cane as the hallway lights flickered overhead like uncertain stars. Somewhere behind him, wind groaned through the eaves, rattling the windows like a warning. When he reached the gallery, the scene had already formed. The body of Lawrence Faversham lay beneath the stained glass skylight, limbs sprawled unnaturally, as if death had struck mid-motion. His eyes were wide open, the pupils fixed on nothing. On the floor beside him, shattered crystal and a pool of blood, dark enough to stain the marble forever. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered. This was not a crime of rage. This was performed. A dozen guests had gathered for the weekend at Greystone under the guise of a charity gala organized by Lady Alicia Renford. But as Poirot now looked around, the faces in the corridor, white with fear, wide-eyed, caught somewhere between guilt and shock, he realized this was no mere accident of timing. Someone had come to kill, and everyone, it seemed, had been ready with a story. "The doctor has been called," said Lady Alicia, her voice composed, her hands tightly clasped. "They'll be here within the hour." Poirot gave a faint nod. "The doctor, madame, will confirm only what I already see. Monsieur Faversham is dead, but what remains, what is curious, is the moment of his death, and who ensured it." Inspector Camden arrived just before 1 in the morning. Sharp, officious, far too eager to take the scene at face value. Blunt force trauma, must have slipped, floors slick as ice in this humidity. "Indeed," Poirot replied, "and yet I do not believe Monsieur Faversham was in the habit of slipping to his death with a wine decanter in his left hand when he was quite famously right-handed." The inspector blinked. Poirot turned his attention to the room. "Let us begin with the alibis, mes amis. I suspect they shall arrive even before the coroner." And arrive they did. Lady Alicia, ever composed, stated she had been in the library with Reverend Paul Whitmore, discussing donations for the orphanage. "We were seated the entire time," she said. "I heard nothing until the scream." Reverend Whitmore, a tall, nervous man in his 50s, nodded in agreement. "She's right. We were going through ledgers. The storm outside was louder than anything else." Poirot said nothing, only adjusted a cufflink. Then came Vivian March, an actress whose fading fame had not dulled her flair for the dramatic. "I was in the music room," she said, eyes red but dry, "playing the piano. You can ask Gregory. He came to find me when the power flickered." Gregory Hale, Lady Alicia's personal assistant, stiffened. "Yes, I checked on her. Around midnight. She was playing Chopin, I think." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You think?" "I don't know the composer exactly." "And yet," Poirot murmured, "you are known to have studied piano at Oxford. A curious lapse." Gregory's mouth opened, then closed. Next was Dr. Marion Kessler, a psychologist from Vienna and an old friend of the deceased. She had been invited to speak at the gala, but had spent most of the evening alone in the conservatory. "I was with the orchids," she said quietly. They bloom at night. Lawrence told me they were his pride. I promised to see them. I never expected. Poirot watched her carefully. There were tears in her eyes, but not on her cheeks. Did you see anyone pass through the corridors? She hesitated. Number only shadows. Ah, shadows. Poirot had learned to trust them more than words. Act 1 had closed with a dead man and 5 neatly wrapped alibis, but as Poirot knew too well, the neater the alibi, the more tightly it attempts to conceal the truth. By morning, the coroner had confirmed what Poirot already suspected. Lawrence Faversham died instantly. The blow had come from behind. No signs of a struggle. The cut on his hand was shallow, likely from the shattered glass. Time of death, shortly after midnight. Poirot returned to the gallery. His eyes moved across the room like a surgeon's scalpel, slicing through the noise, the drama, the desperation. There was a wine decanter, shattered, a set of footprints in the spilled wine, 2 left feet, both right-facing. Not the pattern of a man falling, the pattern of someone stepping backward into blood. Someone was here, Poirot whispered, and someone else was not. Act 2 began with the clues and the careful unraveling of each alibi. Lady Alicia claimed to be seated during the murder, but a drop of wine had stained her sleeve. When pressed, she insisted she had taken a glass earlier. But the wine she drank was white. The stain was red. Reverend Whitmore's story matched, but Poirot noted the indentation on the armchair where he supposedly sat was shallow. Not for a man of his size sitting an hour. Vivian claimed to have played piano, but her nails were too long, newly lacquered, filed. Playing Chopin without breaking a nail? Improbable. Gregory claimed to have arrived during her playing, but the hallway outside the music room was lined with dust from a cracked pipe. No footprints, save for Vivian's heels. Dr. Kessler's story remained the most plausible, except one thing. The orchids. They hadn't bloomed in 2 weeks. It was a tangle of lies, cleverly orchestrated. Each person had a story. Each story had a witness. But Poirot understood something vital. Alibis that align too perfectly are often designed in unison. The real question, he mused, was not who had an alibi, but whose alibi had been built. He walked the halls again that evening, candle in hand, letting the manner speak. He paused before a mirror, cracked at the corner, and stared into its reflection. Behind him, a door was ajar. Faversham's private study. Poirot entered quietly. A locked drawer yielded a diary. Inside, entries in precise handwriting. The final one read, "She knows. I should never have trusted her." Poirot returned to the parlor. He gathered them one last time before the fire. "You each presented alibis," he said, "but only one of you constructed an alibi so flawless it was designed not to clear yourself, but to trap another." He turned to Reverend Whitmore. "You lied about the ledgers. They were dust-covered, never touched. You used Lady Alicia as a shield, because she is above reproach. You believed aligning yourself with her would make you unassailable." Whitmore stammered. That's absurd." Poirot shook his head. "No, monsieur. You hated Faversham, because he was to expose you. A letter he wrote, never sent, accuses you of siphoning donations. Funds, meant for children, stolen." Whitmore collapsed into the chair. "But the real genius," Poirot continued, "was not yours. It was Lady Alicia's." The room froze. "She found out. Instead of stopping you, she used you. She helped craft your alibi because she knew it would break under scrutiny. She planted the stain. She sat near the broken clock, not the library, where she could see the shadow cross the gallery, and let it pass. Lady Alicia stood, face unreadable. "You saw him die," Poirot whispered, "and did nothing, because he betrayed you." Her voice was like silk wrapped around steel. "He ruined my sister's life. He left her destitute while he built his little empire. I told him to fix it." He laughed. Poirot bowed his head. "You didn't kill him, but you allowed it, and that is murder, too." She said nothing. Later, as Whitmore was taken away and the manor returned to its hollow silence, Poirot lingered by the cracked mirror. "Everyone," he murmured, "has an alibi, but only one is a trap," and his reflection stared back, silent and whole. Chapter 9. The Confession That Came Too Soon. The clock struck 3 when the knock came. A single, heavy rap on the door of Hercule Poirot's suite at the Hotel Florin, sharp enough to wake the dead. Poirot had been expecting something. A call, a letter. A clue slipped beneath the door, as had happened in the cases before. But this? A knock in the middle of the night. That was not the voice of mystery. That was the sound of panic. He opened the door slowly, and there stood Leonard. Penbury, disheveled, hollow-eyed, rain streaming from his coat like melted wax. He said only 5 words. "I did it. I killed her." Poirot blinked. "Ah," he said softly. "But, monsieur, why now?" The air inside the room was heavy, like fog pressed between walls. Poirot gestured silently for Leonard to sit. The man dropped into the armchair like a sack of bones. His hands trembled as he reached for the tea that Poirot had not yet poured. The detective watched him closely, his grey eyes measuring every twitch, every breath, every hesitation. "You must tell me everything," Poirot said, but slowly and precisely. Leonard exhaled. "It was Clarissa. I killed Clarissa Vale." Clarissa Vale. The name lingered like perfume in an empty ballroom. Heiress to the Vale shipping fortune. Found dead 3 nights ago in the rose garden of Ashmere House. Her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, her fingers clutching the torn remnants of a lace veil. The death had shocked the country. The circumstances had puzzled even Poirot. No forced entry, no weapon, no struggle, just Clarissa, dead beneath the moonlight, as if she had simply fallen from heaven and shattered on the stones below. Leonard was the house guest, a friend of Clarissa's late fiancé, a man known for his solitude, his quiet melancholy. He had been among the last to see her alive. He had offered an alibi, reading alone by the fire in the West Wing, and until now, Poirot had no reason to doubt him. "I followed her," Leonard said now, voice fraying at the edges. "She went out after dinner. I don't know why. She looked like she was waiting for someone. I called her name. She turned, slipped. I didn't mean to, but I ran. I left her there." Poirot folded his hands. "So, you did not kill her, monsieur, not with intent, not by malice." "I was there," Leonard said. "I didn't help her. I fled. Isn't that enough?" Poirot said nothing. Because it was not enough. Not quite. A confession? Yes. But too soon, too easy. And Poirot had learned in all his years that the truth, when it comes prematurely, is very often masking something far more insidious beneath. Act 1 had already played its hand. Clarissa's death, the mystery of the veil, the garden without footprints, the locked gate that no one had opened, and now this man handing guilt to Poirot like a gift wrapped in fear. But Poirot did not accept gifts without inspecting the stitching. He returned to Ashmere House the next morning. The rain had stopped, but the sky, remained gunmetal grey, the kind of morning that steals warmth from stone and makes even memories feel cold. Inspector Barron met him at the gate. "You heard?" the inspector asked. "Penbury confessed?" "Yes," Poirot said. "I heard, but I do not yet believe." He retraced the path to the rose garden. Clarissa had been found at the centre, head resting on the marble base of the dry fountain. No drag marks, no blood trail, just her body. The veil, later identified as part of a vintage bridal ensemble, had puzzled everyone. Clarissa had never been married. Why was she carrying a veil? Poirot stood where she had fallen. A woman does not walk into a rose garden at midnight, alone, wearing a veil from a wedding dress, unless she means to confront a ghost, or become one. Inside, the other guests were still gathered, under the pretense of mourning. He interviewed them once more. Celeste Dorian, Clarissa's cousin. Cool, immaculate, with a voice like a distant violin. Leonard was obsessed with her, she said, eyes calm. He adored her, but she never loved him. She loved danger. Poirot raised a brow. And whom did she consider dangerous? Celeste looked away. You'd have to ask Daphne. Daphne Renwick, Clarissa's childhood friend, was all nerves and red eyes. Clarissa had secrets, she said, voice trembling. But she wasn't cruel. She was haunted. She thought someone was following her. Did she say who? Daphne hesitated. She said it was someone from before. Before? Before the engagement. Before Leonard. Before everything. Then there was Dr. Oswald Reeve, a family friend, and Clarissa's personal physician. Stoic, reserved, and always watching. She suffered from nightmares, he admitted, recurring. Someone chasing her through the roses. Someone with no face. Poirot's brow creased. That night, he returned to the study, alone. There he found the second veil, hidden in the desk drawer, blood-stained, different fabric, handmade, a duplicate. Act 2 then revealed its first twist. There had been 2 veils, and only one Clarissa. Poirot gathered the guests again. Leonard Penbury confessed, he said, because he believed what he saw. He followed Clarissa into the garden, but it was not Clarissa he saw. It was someone else, wearing the veil, moving like her, framed like her. A trap. He turned to Celeste. You wore the veil. You lured Leonard. You frightened him. You knew he would run. And you made sure he believed he had caused her death. Celeste stared at him. That's madness. Poirot's voice did not rise. No, madame, it is choreography. You are a stage actress, no? You know misdirection. And you knew Clarissa's habits. She always walked at midnight. You wore the veil. He followed. Then you vanished. Then who killed her? Poirot turned. That, he said, is the second confession yet to come. He walked to the mirror above the fireplace. Dr. Reeve, he said, your medical bag. It is missing a scalpel. Reeve's mouth twitched. I lost it weeks ago. Poirot shook his head. Number, you found out Clarissa was going to reveal something, a past affair, a scandal. Perhaps she threatened your position, perhaps more. Reeve's voice was cold. You're wrong. Poirot held up the second veil. It was found in your room, in the closet, with Clarissa's blood. The room fell to silence. Reeve didn't run. He simply sat. She said she would ruin me, he whispered. After everything I did for her, everything I protected. She said she'd go to the board, have me struck off. And for what? Because I prescribed her something without consent. Because I helped her sleep. You helped her forget, Poirot said. Reeve looked up, but someone remembered. Act 3 drew its curtain with slow grace. Leonard had believed himself a killer, because guilt is a costume anyone can wear if the script is written well enough. But the play had been orchestrated by Celeste, and the final act performed by Reeve. Each had their role, each had their motive, and Clarissa, it turned out, had only one crime: truth. She had planned to reveal that Reeve had manipulated her treatment, that Celeste had lied about the inheritance, that Leonard had never meant harm, but was being groomed for guilt. Poirot stood once more in the rose garden that evening, the wind stirring the petals like restless spirits. A confession, he murmured, is only as powerful as the truth behind it. And sometimes the one who breaks first is not the most guilty, only the most human. He looked to the stars above, faint behind the storm clouds. Ah, but the heart, Hastings, it lies even to itself. And the clock struck 4. Chapter 10. The truth. Poirot feared. The mirror cracked, a sharp, clean sound like bones splitting in the dark. Poirot's hand, though steady, trembled just slightly as he traced the web of fractures spreading across the glass. His reflection, distorted now, fragmented, stared back at him with 10 different expressions of doubt. Somewhere behind him, a clock struck 7. But it was not the chime of an ordinary hour. It was the mark of something final. In the hallway outside his London flat, footsteps, slow, deliberate. A knock followed, no urgency, just presence. Poirot opened the door, and there stood the one man he never expected to see again. "Hello, old friend," said Inspector Jules Barre, retired from the Belgian Sûreté, hair grayer, voice lower, but eyes as sharp as ever. He extended a hand, but Poirot did not take it. "You should not be here," Poirot said softly. Barre stepped in anyway. "There's something you need to see. It's about the Ormeaux case." Poirot felt the name fall like a stone into his chest. Ormeaux, a case that had never been spoken of publicly, a file that had vanished 24 years ago, a body never recovered, a suspect never found, or perhaps a truth too dangerous to be found. He followed Barre into the sitting room, where the old inspector placed a single manila envelope on the table. Poirot did not open it. Not yet. "There's been a development," Barre said. "Someone's claiming to be the missing witness. After all this time. She gave us something." Poirot finally opened the envelope, and there it was, a photograph. 3 people stood on a fog-draped dock. 2 men, 1 woman. The men were partially obscured, the woman unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same scar above her brow. Her name was Margot Delise. But she had died. Poirot had been told she died. That night at the dock, when the boat exploded. He closed the envelope and placed it aside. "Jules," he said, "I will go." "You don't have to." "I must." Act 1 began, not with a new crime, but with the echo of an old one. A cold case, with no suspects, no motive, no closure. And yet Poirot had always carried it like a scar beneath his sleeve. The village of Ormeaux was unchanged. Mist still hung over the lake like a veil. The same chapel bell rang in the early dawn. The docks creaked in the wind, their wood swollen with memories. 24 years ago, a young woman named Margot had agreed to testify in a corruption scandal that touched both Parliament and the private arms industry. The night before she was due to meet Poirot at the safe house, she vanished. Her motorboat exploded on the water. 2 bodies were found, burned beyond recognition. The third, hers, was presumed vaporized. Now, it seemed, she was alive. Act 2 revealed more than Poirot wished to find. Margot, now using the name Elise Marnier, lived in a cottage outside the village. She opened the door herself. Older, yes, but those eyes, unforgotten. "I told them not to contact you," she said, voice cold, but not angry. "I had to come. I didn't testify. I ran, and people died because of that. You were told you had no choice." I believed it. She turned away, staring at the lake through the curtain. Poirot scanned the room. No pictures, no clocks, no signs of attachment. The life of someone who expected to disappear again. "There is something else," Margot said, before he could speak. "There's another death. 2 days ago. Gérard Latour. You remember him?" Poirot remembered. A banker tied to the scandal, acquitted, disgraced, but untouched. He was found dead in a hotel room in Geneva. Poison, and in his pocket, a photo of me. Poirot said nothing. Then quietly, "You think someone is killing the men who escaped?" She nodded. "And they'll come for me." Poirot returned to London. And the envelope, once forgotten, had grown heavier. Inside, new names. 3 survivors from the original investigation. All now dead, except one. Sir Benedict Rourke, a former intelligence officer, a man who had long ago asked Poirot not to pursue the Ormeau case too deeply. Poirot arranged a meeting. They spoke in a club of shadows and cigars. "I told you then," Rourke said, "to let it go." "I do not forget," Poirot replied. "Then you remember what's at stake. You think this is about justice? It's about memory, about people who remember too much, and those who ensure they do not. You speak in riddles. I speak in warnings, and I'll give you one more. Walk away." But Poirot could not, because something had begun to twist inside him, a thread unraveling. Act 3 began not with a revelation, but with a question. Why now? Why return the witness? Why reopen the past? Because, he realized, the past had never closed. That night, Poirot sat alone in his apartment, and from the same mirror that had cracked days earlier, he stared at himself and asked a question he had never dared. Had he made a mistake? Not an error of deduction, but something far worse. Had he chosen silence once to protect someone? He returned to Ormeau one last time. The lake was still, the dock quiet. Margot was gone. In her place, Bar. "She was taken," he said. "By whom?" "We don't know, but someone knew you were coming, someone who knew your pattern." Poirot's knees weakened slightly. "There was no leak, was there?" he asked. Bar shook his head. They followed you." Poirot closed his eyes, and the truth came, not like thunder, but like shame. He had led them here. He had brought danger to the one woman who had trusted him, once, long ago, and had vanished to keep herself alive, all for justice, and now justice had failed. He sat at the edge of the dock as dawn broke, grey and golden, and spoke aloud, not to Bar, but to the mist. "I see now. It was never about the witness. It was about me, about what I could not admit, that the mind, no matter how precise, cannot undo what the heart denies." Bar placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then what now?" Poirot's voice was soft. "Now? We find her, if we still can, and then we end this. Not for justice, not for truth, but for forgiveness." The waves whispered below, and the sun rose on the one mystery Poirot feared more than any other, the one where he, himself, had been the catalyst. And the clock behind him struck 8, the hour of reckoning.